One of the biggest misunderstandings people have about avoidant attachment is the assumption that the moment a relationship ends, the avoidant feels the same kind of pain that a deeply attached person feels. Most people expect heartbreak to arrive immediately. They expect tears, longing, sleepless nights, and emotional collapse. But that is often not how the avoidant experience begins. In fact, for many avoidants, the first emotion after a breakup is not grief, it's relief. Now, if you're the person who was left behind, that can feel almost impossible to understand. You invested your time, your energy, your love. You shared your vulnerability. And suddenly the other person appears calm, collected, maybe even happier than before. They seem lighter, more social, more productive. Sometimes they move on so quickly that it feels as though the relationship meant nothing at all. But here's what most people miss. Relief and healing are not the same thing. Psychologically speaking, also known as AVO. Avoidants experience intimacy differently than most people. While many individuals associate closeness with safety, avoidants often associate closeness with pressure. The closer they get to someone, the more their subconscious fears begin to activate. Fears of losing independence, fears of being controlled, fears of being emotionally exposed, fears of eventually disappointing someone or being disappointed themselves. So when the relationship ends, those pressures disappear overnight. The expectations are gone, the difficult conversations are gone, the vulnerability is gone, the emotional demands are gone. And because those stressors vanish, the avoidant nervous system often experiences what feels like freedom. For a while, they genuinely believe they feel better. This is why you will sometimes see an avoidant thriving immediately after a breakup. They're going out more, they're focusing on work, they're investing in hobbies, they're reconnecting with friends. From the outside, it appears as though they've escaped something that was holding them back. But what they're escaping is not necessarily the relationship itself. They're escaping the discomfort that intimacy forced them to confront. That's an important distinction, because growth rarely feels comfortable. Every meaningful relationship eventually brings us face to face with parts of ourselves we'd rather avoid. Our insecurities, our fears, our emotional blind spots. The relationship becomes a mirror. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, that mirror can feel overwhelming. When the relationship disappears, the mirror disappears too. For a moment, that feels like peace. But peace and absence are not the same thing. A quiet room can feel peaceful because conflict has ended, or it can feel quiet because something valuable is missing. In the beginning, avoidants often mistake one for the other. This is why so many people become confused when they see an avoidant. Seemingly unaffected by a breakup, they assume the avoidant never cared. They assume the love wasn't real. They assume they were easily replaced. Yet human emotions rarely work that way. What looks like emotional strength can sometimes be emotional postponement. What looks like moving on can sometimes be emotional suppression. And what looks like certainty can sometimes be a defense against uncertainty. The avoidance relief phase is often powered by distance from the emotional experience itself. They don't have to think about the relationship because they no longer have to engage with the challenges the relationship created. The nervous system calms down, the pressure subsides, and in that temporary calm, they convince themselves that leaving was unquestionably the right decision. But emotions that are avoided do not disappear. They wait. Life has a remarkable way of collecting unpaid emotional debts. Sooner or later, the feelings we postpone come back asking to be acknowledged. The memories return, the questions return. The reality of what was lost begins to emerge. And when that happens, the relief that once felt so convincing starts to reveal its limitations. Because freedom from connection is not the same as fulfillment. And the moment an avoidant discovers that difference is the moment the real timeline truly begins. The first feeling after loss is not always the truth, it is often just the distance between a person and the truth. And once that initial sense of relief begins to settle in, something interesting happens. The avoidant enters a phase that, on the surface, looks remarkably similar to healing. They become busy, focused, engaged with life. They throw themselves into projects, goals, routines, social events, and sometimes even new relationships. From the outside, it appears as though they have moved forward with impressive speed. But psychologically, this phase is often less about moving forward and more about moving on. Away from reflection, away from uncomfortable emotions, away from questions they are not yet ready to answer. You see, the human mind has an extraordinary ability to protect itself from pain. One of its favorite strategies is distraction. Not because distraction solves anything, but because distraction delays the moment when we have to confront what is really happening inside us. For the avoidant, this period can feel incredibly convincing. They wake up each day with evidence that supports their decision. Their stress is lower. Their schedule is full. Their independence has returned. The relationship, which once occupied so much emotional space, gradually fades into the background of daily life. And during this stage, a powerful psychological process begins. The mind starts building a story, not necessarily an honest story, a useful story, a story designed to justify the decision that has already been made. This is something psychologists call cognitive dissonance reduction. When our actions and emotions don't fully align, the mind works hard to eliminate the tension. If an avoidant leaves someone they genuinely cared about, there is an uncomfortable contradiction sitting beneath the surface. If this person mattered, why walk away? If the relationship had value, why end it? To resolve that discomfort, the mind begins collecting evidence. Suddenly, your flaws become more important than your strengths. The difficult moments become more memorable than the beautiful ones. The arguments become larger than the connection. The imperfections become proof that leaving was necessary. This is not always a conscious process. In many cases, they genuinely believe the narrative they are creating. The story feels real because it serves an emotional purpose. It protects them from having to sit with uncertainty. And uncertainty is something avoidant individuals often find deeply uncomfortable because uncertainty eats vulnerability. It creates questions without answers. It forces self-examination. It invites emotions that have been carefully managed for years. So instead, they stay busy. The modern world makes this easier than ever. Endless entertainment, endless work, endless scrolling, endless opportunities to fill every silent moment. A person can spend months avoiding themselves while appearing incredibly productive. But there is a fundamental truth about human psychology that eventually catches up with everyone. Whatever is unresolved does not disappear simply because it is ignored. It remains active beneath the surface. Think about how often people confuse movement with progress. A person can run for miles in the wrong direction. They can be moving constantly and still be getting further away from where they need to go. The same thing happens emotionally. The avoidant may feel forward momentum, but much of that momentum is designed to keep them from turning, around and looking at what was left behind. And yet, life has a way of creating moments that distractions cannot fully cover. A quiet evening, a familiar song, a place they used to visit together, a conversation that unexpectedly touches something deeper. Little cracks begin to appear in the narrative because reality is stubborn. No matter how convincing the story becomes, reality continues waiting beneath it. And reality often asks a simple question. If leaving solved everything, why does something still feel unfinished? That question rarely arrives all at once. It emerges gradually, subtly, almost invisibly. At first, it's easy to dismiss. Then it becomes harder. The distractions that once felt powerful start losing some of their effectiveness. The certainty that once felt absolute becomes less convincing. The emotional distance that seemed permanent begins to shrink. And this is where the timeline starts to shift, because eventually, every distraction reaches its limit. Every justification encounters reality. Every escape route circles back to the self. The avoidant may spend weeks, months, or even years convincing themselves that they have completely moved on. But sooner or later, there comes a moment when the noise quiets down just enough for the truth to be heard. And when the distraction stops speaking, the silence begins to speak instead. You can postpone self-awareness, but you cannot outrun it forever. And that is exactly where the next stage begins. Not with some dramatic realization, not with a sudden emotional breakdown, not with a late-night confession that they made a mistake. The truth usually arrives much more quietly than that. It begins when the distractions stop working. For a while, busyness was enough. The schedule was full. The mind was occupied. The narrative felt stable. But eventually, something happens that no amount of activity can prevent. Life returns to normal. The excitement of freedom becomes routine. The novelty of independence wears off. The emotional adrenaline that accompanied the breakup fades away. And in that ordinary space, something unexpected emerges. Silence. Not the silence of being alone. The silence of absence. There's a profound difference between the two. Being alone simply means no one is physically present. Absence means someone who once occupied a meaningful space in your life is no longer there. One is a circumstance. The other is an experience. This is often the first moment when an avoidant begins to feel the true impact of loss. Because now there is no relationship demanding emotional engagement, but there is also no relationship providing emotional support. No familiar voice, no shared routines, no person who understands certain parts of their world without explanation. And what makes this stage so psychologically fascinating is that the avoidant often doesn't recognize it immediately. The fee. Elling doesn't arrive labeled as grief. It arrives disguised. Sometimes it feels like restlessness. Sometimes it feels like boredom. Sometimes it feels like an unexplainable sense that something is missing. The human mind is remarkably skilled at adapting to what is present. What it struggles with is recognizing the value of something once it becomes absent. We often don't notice how much a person contributed to our emotional stability until their contribution is removed. Think about oxygen. You rarely think about it while you have it. But the moment it becomes unavailable, its importance becomes impossible to ignore. Relationships can function in a similar way. Certain people become woven into the fabric of our daily experience so deeply that we stop consciously noticing their impact. Their support, encouragement, consistency, and presence become part of the background of life. Then they're gone, and the background changes. An avoidant may find themselves reaching for their phone without realizing why. They may experience a small achievement and instinctively think about sharing it with someone who is no longer there. They may encounter a challenge and suddenly recognize the absence of a person who once provided comfort, perspective, or understanding. These moments seem insignificant on their own, but psychologically they are powerful, because every one of them challenges the narrative that leaving carried no real cost. The mind begins gathering new evidence that doesn't fit the story it previously constructed. And this creates tension, not because the avoidant suddenly wants the relationship back, but because reality is becoming more complicated than the simplified explanation they once relied upon. This is where memory begins to change as well. Earlier, the mind focused heavily on flaws and frustrations. Now, with emotional distance from the conflict itself, other memories begin resurfacing. The laughter, the safety, the moments of connection, the feeling of being understood. The quiet moments that once seemed ordinary but now appear meaningful. Human memory is deeply influenced by emotional state. As the defensive walls begin to soften, access to different memories becomes possible. The relationship is no longer viewed exclusively through the lens of pressure. It begins to be viewed through the lens of loss. And loss has a unique way of clarifying value. Not because it idealizes the past, but because it removes the illusion that meaningful things are guaranteed to remain. This is one of the great lessons of human existence. We are often most aware of importance at the moment we confront impermanence. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer once suggested that people rarely appreciate what they possess until they no longer possess it. While that observation may sound pessimistic, it reflects something profoundly true about human nature. Awareness often follows absence. For the avoidant, this stage is deeply uncomfortable because it introduces something they have spent much of their life trying to avoid. Emotional reality, not emotional theory, not intellectual explanations. Reality, the reality that another human being mattered, the reality that their presence had value, the reality that losing them created a space that has not yet been filled. And once that realization begins, it becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Because silence has a way of revealing truths that noise was designed to hide. And when absence starts teaching lessons that presence never could, regret is no longer a possibility, it becomes a process already underway. And once that process is underway, another shift begins to take place, one that many avoidants never expect. Up until this point, the focus has been on absence, on what is missing, on the growing awareness that someone who once occupied an important place in there. Life is no longer there, but now the mind starts doing something different. It starts comparing, not intentionally at first. In fact, most people resist comparison because they want to believe they have moved on. They want to believe the past is behind them. Yet human beings are comparative creatures by nature. We understand value through contrast. We understand depth through experience. We understand what something meant by encountering what comes after it. And this is where the avoidant often enters what I call the comparison trap. Because eventually they meet new people, they have new conversations, they form new connections, and for a while the novelty feels refreshing. New experiences create excitement. New faces create curiosity. New possibilities create hope. There is no emotional history to navigate, no unresolved conflicts, no expectations built over time. Everything feels lighter. But here's the challenge with novelty. It can imitate depth for a short period of time. A new connection often feels exciting because it is unexplored. The uncertainty creates anticipation. The possibilities seem endless because reality has not yet revealed itself. And many avoidants mistake this excitement for proof that they made the right decision. Yet eventually, novelty fades. And when it does, comparison begins. The new person may be attractive, they may be intelligent, they may be interesting, but they are not you. They do not share the same memories. They do not understand the same emotional language. They do not know the stories behind certain reactions, habits, fears, and dreams. The avoidant begins to notice small differences. Perhaps the conversation feels pleasant, but lacks the depth they once experienced. Perhaps the connection feels easy, but not meaningful. Perhaps the chemistry exists, but the sense of emotional safety is missing. And slowly, almost against their will, they start measuring. Not because they want to return to the past, but because the human mind naturally evaluates present experiences against previous ones. This is when something fascinating happens psychologically. The qualities that once seemed ordinary begin to appear extraordinary. The patience they received, the acceptance they received, the understanding they received, the consistency they received, all the things that felt normal when they were available suddenly become rare when they are not. This is one of the great paradoxes of human nature. We adapt so quickly to what is good in our lives that we stop recognizing its value. We assume it will always be there. We begin treating extraordinary things as ordinary simply because they have become familiar. Then familiarity disappears, and value becomes visible. The avoidant may discover that emotional maturity is rarer than they thought, that genuine loyalty is harder to find than they imagined. That authentic connection cannot simply be replaced by another person occupying the same role. Because people are not interchangeable. A relationship is not a product. A human being is not a position waiting to be filled. Every meaningful connection creates something unique that cannot be perfectly recreated elsewhere. And this realization creates a new kind of discomfort. Earlier stages were centered around freedom from pressure. Now the discomfort comes from recognizing the cost of that freedom. Every choice carries a price. Choosing independence has a price. Choosing intimacy has a price. Choosing distance has a price. Choosing connection has a price. The question is never whether a price exists. The question is whether the price was worth paying. For the avoidant, this stage often marks the first time they genuinely begin questioning that calculation. Because now they have data. Now they have perspective. Now they have experiences beyond the relationship itself. And many discover that what they thought was easily replaceable was actually deeply significant. This doesn't mean they immediately reach out. It doesn't mean they suddenly transform. Awareness and action are not the same thing, but awareness changes everything. Once you see value, you cannot completely unsee it. Once you recognize what someone brought into your life, it becomes difficult to pretend their absence has no impact. And this is where the emotional journey becomes even more challenging, because comparison eventually leads to a question that can no longer be avoided. What if the problem wasn't the relationship? What if the thing they kept trying to escape followed them into every new experience? And when that question finally takes hold, the focus shifts away from what was lost and toward the person staring back from the mirror. What we miss most is often not the person we left, but the value we failed to recognize when they were still there. And that is where the timeline reaches its most uncomfortable stage. Because up until now, the avoidant has been focused outward. First, they focused on escaping the pressure of the relationship. Then they focused on distractions. Then they focused on the absence you left behind. Then they focused on comparing new experiences to what they once had. But eventually a moment arrives when none of those explanations feel sufficient anymore. The spotlight turns inward, and that is when the real confrontation begins. One of the most transformative moments in any person's life occurs when they stop asking, "What happened to me?" and start asking, "What role did I play in what happened?" That question changes everything. Because it shifts someone from being a spectator in their own story to becoming a participant responsible for their choices. For many avoidants, this is the stage where an identity crisis emerges, not necessarily in a dramatic sense. See, but in a deeply psychological one, they begin noticing patterns. Different partner, same emotional distance, different relationship, same fears, different circumstances, same urge to withdraw when intimacy increases. At first, these similarities are easy to dismiss. After all, every relationship has unique challenges. Every person brings different dynamics. Every breakup has its own story. But eventually, the pattern becomes too obvious to ignore. And patterns are powerful because they reveal what isolated events cannot. A single failed relationship can be blamed on incompatibility. Multiple relationships that end in remarkably similar ways force a different question. What if the common denominator is me? Now, this is not about blame. Blame is rarely useful. This is about awareness. Because awareness is where growth begins. The philosopher Carl Jung famously wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life. You will call it fate." That idea captures this stage perfectly. For years, many avoidants believe they are simply reacting to circumstances. They believe they are leaving because something isn't right. They believe distance is the solution. They believe freedom lies somewhere beyond the relationship. But when the same emotional struggles keep reappearing, a new possibility emerges. Maybe the problem isn't following them. Maybe they are carrying it. That realization can be deeply unsettling because it challenges an entire self-concept. It forces someone to examine defenses that once felt necessary. The need for control, the fear of dependence, the instinct to create distance whenever vulnerability appears, the habit of interpreting emotional closeness as pressure instead of connection. Suddenly, these behaviors no longer look like strengths. They start looking like survival strategies. And survival strategies that protect us in one season of life can imprison us in another. This is one of the most important psychological truths we can understand. The mind does not care about happiness nearly as much as it cares about familiarity. If a person learned early in life that vulnerability led to disappointment, their mind may continue avoiding vulnerability long after the original threat has disappeared. The strategy remains even when the environment changes. The armor stays on long after the battle is over. And that armor comes at a cost, because the same walls that keep pain out also keep love out. The same distance that protects against rejection also prevents intimacy. The same independence that feels safe can eventually become isolation. For the avoidant, this stage often feels like standing between two realities. The old reality says, keep protecting yourself. The emerging reality says, your protection may be the very thing that's hurting you. And that tension creates an internal conflict unlike anything they have experienced before. Because now the issue is no longer whether the relationship was perfect. No relationship is perfect. The issue is whether fear was making decisions that should have been made by wisdom. Whether self-protection was quietly sabotaging connection. Whether running from discomfort was also running from growth. This is the moment when regret begins evolving into something deeper. Self-recognition. And self-recognition is powerful because it removes the illusion that changing external circumstances automatically creates a different life. A new partner does not solve an old wound. A new city does not solve an old wound. A new beginning does not solve an old wound. Wherever we go, we eventually meet ourselves. That is why this stage is so pivotal. It is the point where the avoidant stops seeing the breakup as an isolated event and starts seeing it as part of a larger pattern that has shaped the relationships, decisions, and emotional world for years. And once a person truly sees the pattern, they can no longer honestly pretend it isn't there. Because the hardest truth to face is also the one that sets us free. The problem that follows you everywhere is usually the one living within you. And that brings us to the final stage, the stage most people assume comes first, but which actually comes last. This is the moment of genuine regret. Not imagined regret. Not temporary loneliness. Not nostalgia on a difficult night. Not the discomfort of being single. Real regret. And what makes this stage so fascinating is that it rarely arrives when the avoidant is at their lowest. In fact, it often arrives when they are becoming a better version of themselves. This is the part that surprises people. Most assume regret appears when life falls apart. They imagine the avoidant sitting alone, overwhelmed by sadness, suddenly realizing what they lost. While that can happen, the deepest form of regret usually emerges from something far more profound. Growth, because growth changes perception, and perception changes everything. You can only understand something from the level of awareness you possess at the time. Every decision you make is filtered through your current understanding of yourself, your fears, your beliefs, and your emotional capacity. The person who walked away from the relationship was operating from one level of consciousness. But months or years later, after reflection, experience, and self-examination, that same individual may see the past through entirely different eyes. And that's where the pain begins, because now they understand what they could not understand then. They begin recognizing moments they once dismissed, acts of patience they once overlooked, expressions of love they once took for granted, attempts at connection they once interpreted as pressure. The relationship itself started. Art's looking different not because history changed, but because the observer changed. This is one of the most powerful realities of human life. The facts of the past remain the same, but the meaning we assign to those facts evolves as we evolve. And sometimes growth creates gratitude. Sometimes it creates wisdom, and sometimes it creates regret, because with greater awareness comes a difficult realization. I finally understand what was being offered to me, not perfection. Not a flawless relationship, not a person without weaknesses, but something real, something meaningful, something that required emotional courage to receive. And perhaps they were not ready to receive it. That realization can be heartbreaking because it forces someone to confront the gap between who they were and who they are becoming. The avoidant begins seeing how fear shaped decisions, how self-protection disguised itself as logic, how emotional distance disguised itself as independence, how leaving felt like freedom when in reality it was often an escape from vulnerability. And now, standing on the other side of that awareness, they can finally see the cost. Not the cost of staying, the cost of leaving. This is where genuine regret differs from simple missing someone. Missing someone is emotional. Regret is existential. Missing someone says, I wish they were here. Regret says, I wish I had understood. One speaks to absence. The other speaks to insight. And insight carries a unique weight because it cannot be undone. Once you see clearly, you cannot return to ignorance. Once you recognize the value of what you had, you cannot honestly convince yourself it meant nothing. This is why so many avoidants find themselves haunted not by what happened, but by what could have happened, the future they never gave a chance, the conversations they never had, the vulnerability they never rise. The love they never fully allowed themselves to experience. And perhaps the most painful realization of all is that personal growth does not operate on the timeline we wish it would. Life has a strange sense of irony. Sometimes the lessons arrive after the opportunity has passed. Sometimes the wisdom appears after the choice has already been made. Sometimes the emotional maturity necessary to sustain a relationship develops only after the relationship itself is gone. And that is where the deepest regret often lives. Not in losing a person, but in finally becoming capable of appreciating them when they are no longer yours to appreciate. Now, does this mean every avoidant returns? Number. Does it mean every story gets a second chance? Number. Life is more complex than that. Some people reconnect. Some do not. Some relationships are rebuilt. Others remain powerful lessons carried forward into the future. But regardless of the outcome, the psychological journey remains remarkably similar. The avoidant who truly grows eventually reaches a moment where excuses lose their power. The blame fades. The defenses soften. The narrative collapses. And all that remains is the truth. The truth that love was offered. The truth that fear got involved. The truth that growth arrived. And the truth that growth sometimes arrives too late. Yet there is a lesson here that extends far beyond avoidant attachment. It applies to every human being. The greatest losses in life are rarely caused by a lack of opportunity. They are often caused by a lack of awareness while the opportunity was still present. Because the ultimate tragedy is not losing something valuable. The ultimate tragedy is realizing its value only after it's gone. And the ultimate wisdom is learning to recognize what matters before life has to teach you through loss. As we bring this conversation to a close, it's important to understand that this speech was never really about avoidance. It's about human nature, because all of us, in one way or another, have moments where fear speaks louder than love, moments where self-protection feels safer than vulnerability, moments where we fail to recognize the value of something while it's still in our hands. The avoidance timeline is ultimately a story about awareness. First comes relief, then distraction, then absence, then comparison, then self-confrontation, and finally regret, not because they are uniquely flawed, but because growth often follows the very experiences we spend our lives trying to avoid. And if you're listening to this because you lost someone with avoidant tendencies, remember this. Their timeline is not your responsibility. Your job is not to wait for someone to wake up. Your job is not to convince someone of your worth. Your job is not to sacrifice your future, hoping another person reaches a realization. Your responsibility is to continue growing, healing, and becoming the strongest version of yourself. Because the most powerful shift happens when you stop asking, will they regret losing me? And start asking, am I building a life so meaningful that my happiness no longer depends on that answer? And for those who recognize themselves in this avoidant journey, understand this. Awareness is not punishment. Awareness is freedom. The moment you see the pattern, you gain the power to change it. The moment you stop running from vulnerability, you open the door to the very connection you've been searching for all along. At the end of the day, every relationship leaves us with a choice. We can use loss as proof that love is dangerous, or we can use loss as proof that love matters. One path creates walls, the other creates wisdom. And the people who build extraordinary lives are not the ones who never experience heartbreak. They are the ones who allow heartbreak to teach them what fear never could. Because time reveals what emotions hide, growth reveals what pride denies, and eventually life teaches us all the same lesson. The people who matter most are rarely lost in a single moment. They are lost in the moments we failed to appreciate while they were still there. And the greatest success in love is not being remembered by someone who regrets losing you. It's becoming someone who never has to regret losing yourself.